trade war environment, and this is going to harm the U.S. economy in a major way.
History is written by the winners, but what if the winners aren't who you expect? In a shocking twist, Canada and Mexico just flipped the script on the U.S. auto industry, sending shockwaves through Detroit. For decades, American automakers led the EV race, with Canada and Mexico as supporting players. Not anymore. These nations have launched a bold EV trade strategy, with massive investments and new factories, threatening US dominance. Washington is already looking for ways to hit back. Could this spark an all-out EV trade war? Will US automakers reclaim control, or is this the start of a power shift? This battle isn't just about EVs, it's about control and the future of North America's auto industry. How the US dominated North American auto trade. The North American auto industry has always had one player at the top of their game. And guess who that has been? Yep, the United States. For over a century, American automakers like Ford, General Motors, and later Tesla haven't just led the market, they've controlled it. And although Canada and Mexico have been part of the system, they were just as supporting players. They mostly majored in manufacturing hubs, low-cost labor providers, and key suppliers.
And let's make sure that we make of Canada a global leader in the green industrial transformation.
But never the main act. Now, it makes us wonder how the US has managed to call the shots for this long. Think about it. When you picture iconic cars, what comes to mind? Obviously, the roaring muscle of a Ford Mustang, the all-time dominant Chevy Silverado, maybe even the futuristic Tesla Model S. These aren't just American cars, but global symbols of US auto supremacy. And the reason they've ruled the roads isn't just about branding, but about their strategy. For decades, American automakers have relied on a finely tuned machine. The ones powered by trade deals like NAFTA, a trilateral trade agreement signed by Canada, Mexico, and the United States, created a free trade zone in North America that came into force on January 1, 1994, and more recently, the USMCA.
We're trying to remember this. We want them to go into the private sector.
This wasn't just a casual arrangement, it was a power move. The US would design the vehicles, control the technology, and own the brands. At the same time, Canada and Mexico would do the dirty work, assemble parts, manufacture engines, and handle the labor-intensive processes. And it worked. By the mid-2010s, Mexico alone produced over 3.5 million vehicles annually, with most of them heading straight for US roads. Canada wasn't far behind, housing major assembly plants for giants like Ford, GM, and Stellantis. NAFTA and USMCA, the rulebook that kept the US on top. Now, let's talk about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, signed in 1994. This was the golden ticket that allowed automakers to shuffle parts across borders without massive tariffs. It made production cheaper, streamlined supply chains, and ensured that the profits flowed straight back to Detroit, no matter where a car was put together. However, just like most US departments, NAFTA wasn't perfect. While it allowed Mexico and Canada to manufacture cars, it also locked them into a dependency on the US. Mexico's and Canada's auto industries barely make it without access to American tech, investment, and, most importantly, the US market. Fast forward to 2020, when NAFTA will be replaced with USMCA. This was supposed to be the modernized version of NAFTA, with even stricter rules in favor of American manufacturing. Under this new deal, 75% of a vehicle's components must be made in North America to qualify for tariff-free trade.
Canada will be responding to the US trade action with 25% tariffs.
And if that's not all, a significant chunk of labor has to be done by workers earning at least $16 per hour. Can you imagine how much of a direct challenge this was to Mexico's lower wages? But what did this translate to? The US still had the upper hand. It still dictated the rules, controlled the markets, and ensured that, no matter how many cars rolled off assembly lines in Canada and Mexico, the real winners would always be in the United States. But here's the real question. If the US had all the tech, all the innovation, and all the power, how did Canada and Mexico manage to turn the tables? The EV factor, America's technological grip. And then came the electric revolution. Tesla changed the game, proving that the future of the auto industry wasn't gasoline, but battery-powered technology. And guess where that technology was concentrated? Yep, the US. Canada and Mexico had factories, but they didn't have their own Teslas, their own cutting-edge EV platforms, or their own next-gen battery innovations. Instead, they remained locked into the American system, assembling cars that relied on US patents, US research, and US supply chains. Even as late as 2022, 90% of Mexico's car exports were still going straight to the United States, with electric models making up only a fraction of the mix. Canada still had to depend on US automakers to decide what gets produced in its own plants. The hierarchy was clear. The US innovated, and its neighbors followed. But that's when they said, enough is enough. For decades, this system worked flawlessly with the US as innovators. The US dominated, whereas Canada and Mexico played along. North America's auto industry functioned as one big, profitable empire. But now, Canada and Mexico are rewriting the rules, and they're doing it in a way that the US never saw coming. With massive new EV investments, independent supply chains, and trade deals that cut the US out of the picture, the very countries that were once America's most loyal manufacturing partners are now stepping out of its shadow and into the spotlight. And Washington is particularly unhappy about it. So, what happens when the empire starts to crumble? What's the US doing to fight back? And could this be the start of an all-out North American EV trade war? The big shift: Canada and Mexico's bold move. Now, if you thought Canada and Mexico were just going to keep playing second fiddle to the US auto industry, think again. These two nations are in the middle of a radical transformation, and it all revolves around one thing: electric vehicles. Instead of relying on American automakers like Ford, GM, or Tesla to dictate their manufacturing future, Canada and Mexico have decided to take a new approach. They are teaming up to create their own independent EV industry. This means that the duo will receive massive investments in EV factories, not just assembly plants, but full-fledged production hubs for their own electric vehicles. This also means that they will have new battery manufacturing plants. This, by the way, is huge, because EV batteries are the most expensive and crucial part of an electric car. In addition, they are including an independent supply chain, so they don't have to rely on US automakers for critical components like lithium-ion batteries, semiconductors, and rare earth metals. It's a massive play, and the best part is that it's already happening. Take Mexico, for example. The country is on track to become a top 5 EV producer globally by 2026. Yes, that's soon. Companies like BMW, General Motors, and Tesla have already announced billion-dollar investments in Mexico to build new EV production facilities. And this isn't just talk. Mexico's government is actively working to strengthen its domestic EV industry, with incentives that make it cheaper and easier for automakers to set up shop south of the border. And what about Canada? Well, they're not just sitting this one out. In fact, Canada is pouring billions into battery technology, green energy, and electric vehicle infrastructure. According to news sources, Volkswagen is building a $7 billion battery plant in Ontario, Canada.
Volkswagen, the company, is going to build an electric vehicle battery plant in southwestern Ontario.
Companies like Stellantis and LG Energy Solution are also setting up major battery production facilities. This isn't just about making cars anymore. This is about owning the future of the auto industry. But the question is, why now? The global auto industry is in the middle of its biggest transition ever. Governments around the world are cracking down on gas-powered cars, and automakers are scrambling to meet aggressive EV targets. The European Union, for example, has already set a 2035 deadline to ban the sale of new gasoline and diesel cars. China, too, is way ahead. They are already investing hundreds of billions into EV production and, in turn, dominating the global battery market. However, for the US, as much as Washington is pushing for more EVs, political battles and supply chain struggles have made the transition slower than expected. And that's where Canada and Mexico saw their big opportunity. Rather than waiting for the US to lead the charge, they're positioning themselves as independent powerhouses in the global EV race. They're cutting deals, securing resources, and making sure they don't get left behind while the rest of the world moves on from gas-powered cars. Now, here's the part that's got Washington panicking. The US auto industry always assumed that Canada and Mexico would always rely on American automakers to guide the market. Instead, they're going rogue, forming their own trade pacts and setting up an EV future where American companies aren't calling the shots anymore. And what's scary is that if Canada and Mexico successfully build their own EV industry, they could actually start competing with the US, and not just as manufacturing hubs, but as direct rivals in the global auto market. Imagine a world where Mexico, not Detroit, is the new hub for EV production, or where Canadian-built batteries power the next generation of electric cars without any US involvement whatsoever. That's not just a shift, but a revolution. So, what happens next? The US isn't exactly known for sitting back and watching its global dominance slip away. If Canada and Mexico start pulling ahead in EV production, expect major retaliation from Washington. The US could slap massive import taxes on Canadian and Mexican EVs, making it harder for them to sell their cars in the American market. The US government could also put pressure on automakers to keep production within the US, limiting investments in Canada and Mexico. Who knows, maybe even the US could double down on tax credits and incentives that favor American-made electric vehicles, cutting Canada and Mexico out of key markets. The possibilities of their comeback are endless. And if I'm right, this could be the start of a global trade war. Don't you think so? Why Canada and Mexico are betting on EVs? All right, first, let's get one thing straight. The EV revolution isn't something that's coming. It's already here. Across the globe, governments and non-governmental organizations are pushing gasoline cars to extinction every day. In Europe, for example, by 2035, gas-powered cars will be banned totally. Yep, zero importation of new petrol or diesel cars is allowed. As a car enthusiast, I can't imagine a world without diesel engines. In China, they're already dominating the EV game. According to a report, China is producing over 60% of the world's electric vehicles. And that's not all. They are also controlling the global battery supply chain. North America, on the other hand, wants to lead in the EV race, but political infighting and supply chain issues have slowed things down, and that's exactly where Canada and Mexico saw their opportunity. Rather than waiting for the US to figure things out, these two nations are making their move. They have already begun investing billions into electric vehicles, batteries, and charging infrastructure. It's quite true to say billions are pouring into EVs. And when I say billions, I mean big, serious money. Take Canada, for example. The government is throwing huge incentives at automakers to build battery plants and EV factories within its borders. Volkswagen is setting up a $7 billion battery gigafactory in Ontario.
Volkswagen's $7 billion investment is a tremendous win.
Stellantis and LG Energy's other $5 billion battery plant is on the way. Ford, a $1.8 billion investment to shift its Canadian production to electric vehicles. Canada isn't messing around. They're positioning themselves as the battery capital of North America, making sure that the most critical component of an EV, the battery, doesn't have to come from China anymore. Well, Mexico is going just as hard. Mexico is already a manufacturing powerhouse, and now they're using that advantage to dominate EV production. Tesla, for example, is building a massive new gigafactory in Nuevo León, right near the Texas border. Not only that, BMW is also making an $18 million investment for an EV plant in San Luis Potosí. General Motors is also in the race, with a $1 billion revamp to make electric vehicles in Ramos Arizpe, and this is just the beginning. So why are Canada and Mexico able to pull this off? Simple. One is raw materials. Canada is sitting on a gold mine of lithium, cobalt, and nickel. These are exactly what you need to make EV batteries. Instead of relying on China, the world can now look to Canada for homegrown battery materials. Another reason is cheap labor. Mexico has one of the most cost-effective manufacturing workforces in the world. It's cheaper to build EVs in Mexico than in the US, making it the go-to destination for automakers looking to cut costs. Strategic trade position also puts both Canada and Mexico at the forefront. Both Canada and Mexico have privileged access to the US market through the USMCA trade deal. That means automakers setting up shop in these countries can still sell to the US without massive tariffs. In short, both these countries have the resources, the workforce, and the trade deals to bypass the US and still dominate the EV industry. This move is about controlling the future of transportation. The global shift to EVs is the biggest transformation in the auto industry since Henry Ford invented the assembly line. The countries that dominate EV production and battery supply will control the future of global trade. Canada and Mexico aren't just making cars anymore. They're staking their claim as global leaders in the EV industry and doing it in a way that cuts the US out of the equation. And that, right there, is the biggest twist of all. For decades, the US called the shots in North American auto manufacturing. Now, Canada and Mexico are taking matters into their own hands. And if Washington doesn't wake up soon, they might find themselves playing catch-up in an industry they were supposed to lead. The balance of power is shifting fast, and here's the kicker. This isn't just about competition, it's about survival. As Canada and Mexico break free from Detroit's grip, the US auto industry isn't just losing ground, it's losing control of its own backyard. Leaves me to wonder, why are they losing grip? If you think GM, Ford, and even Tesla are safe from this, think again. Right now, American automakers still dominate North America, but Canada and Mexico are building something bigger, an independent EV supply chain that doesn't rely on Detroit. The moment they succeed, US automakers risk losing the very market they once controlled. Look at Mexico. It's already the fourth largest auto exporter in the world, thanks to massive investments from BMW, Tesla, and General Motors. Yes, even GM is shifting south. Mexico is surely on track to become one of the top EV producers globally by 2026. Meanwhile, Canada is locking down battery production with multi-billion-dollar deals from Volkswagen, Stellantis, and Honda. If you think this is just about assembling cars, you're missing the bigger picture. The US is about to become just another buyer in a market it once ruled. The math doesn't lie. In 2023 alone, foreign automakers accounted for over 55% EV sales in the US, a number that's only going to grow as Canada and Mexico scale up. And while Ford and GM are trying to pivot, they're way behind. Tesla? Sure, they're still a leader, but with BYD in China outpacing them in production and Mexico giving them cheaper manufacturing alternatives, even Elon Musk isn't safe from this shakeup. Another reason is that supply chains are moving and the US is losing out. For decades, if you bought a car in Canada or Mexico, there was a very good chance that a significant portion of it came from the US. American-made engines, transmissions, and electronics flowed freely across borders, ensuring Detroit stayed at the heart of North American auto production. But not anymore. Now, both Canada and Mexico are cutting out the middleman, which, in this case, is the United States. Instead of relying on US auto parts, they're striking direct deals with European and Asian suppliers. Korean and Japanese battery makers are setting up shop in Canada. Mexico is importing Chinese EV components to scale production faster. As a result, there are fewer American parts, fewer American jobs, and less American influence over the vehicles of tomorrow. It's no coincidence that US auto parts exports to Canada and Mexico have been shrinking while Chinese, South Korean, and European suppliers have been gaining ground. Canada, for example, has secured $15 billion in battery investments from South Korea alone, giving them a direct line to Asia's advanced EV tech. No US involvement needed. The US is losing its EV crown, and fast. If the United States loses its grip on EVs, it's not just about losing car sales, it's about losing control over the future of mobility. The US is already falling behind China, where over 60% of all EVs are made. Now, Canada and Mexico are making their own power plays, meaning the American EV industry is getting squeezed from both sides. The Biden administration poured billions into bringing EV and battery production back to the US. But let's be real. Government incentives can only go so far when the market forces are shifting elsewhere. Canada and Mexico are offering automakers cheaper labor, stronger trade advantages, and easier access to materials. The US is bogged down by regulatory red tape, higher labor costs, and a political battlefield that makes long-term investment uncertain. And let's not forget Tesla. Elon Musk has already expanded into Mexico, meaning even the biggest name in American EVs is looking beyond the US for future growth. If Tesla, the company that put American EVs on the map, sees more value in Mexico than in Michigan, that should tell you everything you need to know. Is a trade war brewing? How the US might retaliate? If history has taught us anything, it's that when the US economy is threatened, Washington fights back. And if Canada and Mexico keep rising as EV powerhouses, a trade war might just be around the corner, don't you think? All right, imagine a world where Canada and Mexico have fully established their own EV supply chains, producing batteries, motors, and vehicles without relying on US automakers. Their cars are cheaper because labor costs are lower. Their supply chains are independent of American manufacturers, and suddenly they're flooding the US market with EVs that are just as good, if not better, than what Ford and GM are offering. Yeah, Washington's not going to let that happen without a fight, right? And that's exactly what we think is about to happen. The US has used tariffs as a weapon before, and it could do the same again. Take Trump's 25% tariff on imported steel in 2018, which was justified under national security concerns, but really aimed at boosting US manufacturing. That move sparked a global backlash, but it worked. US steel production surged exponentially. If he again takes the same approach, we could see steep tariffs slapped on Canadian and Mexican EVs. The government could just argue that they are protecting American jobs and national security. That will sell. And let's not forget the USMCA trade agreement.
NAFTA, called USMCA, sort of just works. MCA.
While it was meant to create fair trade between North American partners, it also gives the US leverage to impose tariffs if it believes unfair competition is at play. So, could the US claim that Canada and Mexico are unfairly subsidizing their EV industries? Absolutely. And that could be the perfect excuse for tariffs. Will this trade face-off bring rise to policies like Biden's Buy American policy? I really hope not. Joe Biden, during his administration, already made his stance clear. He wanted EVs built in the US by American workers using American materials. The Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, of 2022 included massive tax credits for EVs, but only for those built in the US. That was a direct hit against Canada and Mexico, whose EVs do not qualify for the full credit. Now, could President Trump, amidst this brewing EV trade war, opt for such a policy? Now, imagine the current administration doubling down on Buy American. They could restrict more incentives to US-built cars, making it even harder for Canadian and Mexican EVs to compete. They could also pressure American automakers like GM and Tesla to stop expanding into Mexico by threatening penalties or blocking federal funding. It wouldn't be the first time the US used economic pressure to steer trade in its favor. Remember the 2009 bailout for GM and Chrysler? One of the conditions was keeping production in the US. Could Washington do something similar with EV investments? 100%. One thing that history has taught us is that the US surely knows how to play dirty. The US has never shied away from economic warfare, and history is full of examples of how far Washington is willing to go to protect its industries. Take the 1980s US-Japan trade war. Back then, Japanese automakers were crushing American car companies, so the US forced import quotas on Japanese vehicles, pushing Toyota and Honda to build factories in the US instead of exporting their cars from Japan. The result? Japanese companies adapted, but the US bought itself time to catch up. Then there's the Trump-era China trade war. The US imposed massive tariffs on Chinese goods, targeting everything from steel to electronics. China retaliated, but American industries were still protected. at least in the short term. Could the US pull a similar move against Canada and Mexico? Definitely. But would a trade war backfire? Here's the thing. If the US goes too hard on Canada and Mexico, it could trigger unintended consequences. First, higher tariffs mean higher car prices for American consumers. If US-built EVs remain more expensive than their Canadian or Mexican counterparts, buyers might just look elsewhere, like China or Europe. Second, a trade war could push automakers to move even more production overseas. If Mexico and Canada start feeling the heat, they might cut deals with China or Europe instead of relying on US buyers. That would weaken US influence even further. And finally, what about retaliation? If the US blocks Canadian and Mexican EVs,
Donald Trump drew first blood. He slapped tariffs on 3 major players: Canada, Mexico, and China.
both countries could respond with their own tariffs on American-made goods. Mexico is one of the biggest buyers of US agricultural products. Canada imports billions in US oil and machinery. If they hit back, US exports could suffer massively. But what if the US isn't just battling Canada and Mexico? By flexing too hard, it could hand a massive advantage to its biggest rivals. While Washington draws battle lines, global players are quietly positioning themselves to outmaneuver the US entirely. Global reactions and market dynamics. Now, let's talk about the global response because, trust me, the rest of the world isn't just sitting back and watching. The North American EV trade tensions are sending shockwaves through the industry, and automakers from Europe to Asia are recalibrating their strategies. First up, China. Now, if there's one country that loves an opportunity to dominate an industry, it's China. The moment Canada and Mexico started shaking things up, China saw an opening. BYD, NIO, and XPeng aren't just competing in their domestic market anymore. They're aggressively expanding into Latin America, offering cheaper, tech-packed EVs that could flood North American streets. Mexico, in particular, has already welcomed Chinese investment in battery production, a move that could sideline American suppliers entirely. If the US tries to retaliate with more tariffs or protectionist policies, guess what? China wins again. And then there's Europe. The EU has always prided itself on sustainability, but even they weren't expecting North America to pull away from the US in the EV race. Companies like Volkswagen, BMW, and Renault are now looking at Mexico and Canada as prime locations for future expansion. Why? Because it's cheaper and politically safer than battling ever-changing US policies. Volkswagen has already announced a $5 billion investment in Canada for battery manufacturing, and this could just be the beginning. Meanwhile, Germany is watching closely, because if North America strengthens its own EV supply chain, European automakers might lose their grip on a major export market. Now, let's talk about Japan and South Korea. Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, and Kia have all been massive players in North America, but if Canada and Mexico start building their own self-sustaining EV ecosystems, what happens to their US-based plants? Suddenly, those facilities aren't as essential. Hyundai, for example, is already shifting focus towards Mexico's lower production costs and easier access to raw materials. Meanwhile, LG and Samsung SDI, two of the biggest names in battery tech, are re-evaluating their US partnerships and looking at Mexico as a more attractive option. If the US loses these key players, its dominance in the EV sector could crumble faster than anyone expected. The fact still remains, global supply chains are already starting to shift, and not in favor of the US. Remember how America was the undisputed king of the auto industry for nearly a century? Well, times are changing. The US has spent years building dependencies on foreign suppliers, and now those suppliers are finding new partners. Canada and Mexico aren't just building EVs, they're setting up entire supply networks that could operate independently of American influence. With foreign investment from Europe and China on the way, the US isn't calling the shots anymore. And let's not forget the investors. Wall Street hates uncertainty, and with the US caught in trade disputes, big money is flowing elsewhere. Just look at the stock market. Canadian and Mexican EV startups are suddenly getting international attention, while US automakers like Ford and GM are struggling with fluctuating policies and supply chain bottlenecks. If the trend continues, investors might abandon American auto giants in favor of companies with less red tape and more stable growth. That's a disaster waiting to happen for Detroit. So, what do you think? Is the US losing its grip on the EV market, or is there still time to turn things around? The EV revolution is happening with or without the US. If Washington chooses the path of a trade war, it might slow Canada and Mexico down, but it won't stop them. In fact, it might push them to become even more independent, cutting the US out of the equation entirely. And if that happens, well, the era of American auto dominance won't just decline, it could be gone for good. Thanks for watching this video, and see you at the next one.